All right. Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to our latest Givers, Doers, and Thinkers webinar, How to Supercharge Your Year-End Giving. I'm so glad you could join us here today. My name's Joe Grecht. I'm the director of the Center for Civil Society, which, along with AmPhil, is hosting today's event. Founded in 2021 as a project of AmPhil and now an independent nonprofit, the Center for Civil Society stands on the front lines of the fight to restore American civil society. We exist to unshackle principled organizations and multiply the impact of philanthropic giving by providing practical training and thought leadership for principled nonprofits to achieve their mission. Each year, we run dozens of programs to help nonprofits like yours succeed. These programs include masterclasses, webinars like this one, and in-person events, as well as our online journal, Philanthropy Daily. Next month on October, or this month now, on October 23rd and 24th, we're going to be hosting our 4th annual Givers, Doers, and Thinkers Conference. The event's going to be held on the campus of Pepperdine University in Malibu, and the theme will be K to Campus, how the education reform movement can reshape higher education. Tickets are now available, and we'd love to have you join us if you can to hear from Victor Davis Hanson, Mark Bauerlein, and dozens of other speakers. For more information on that or any of our other events, you can visit centerforcivilsociety.org. Okay, we want today's webinar to be interactive, so I want to encourage you to please, as we're making the presentation today, use the chat box to ask any questions that you may have. We may stop during the presentation to talk about some of your questions, and we'll certainly have time at the end of today's webinar to answer all the questions that you have. This class is being presented by 3 experienced fundraisers from AmPhil. So let me introduce you to our panel, and then we'll get started. Aaron Brown is a director at AmPhil and leads our Southeastern consulting team based out of Atlanta. He previously served as the Director of Development for the Foundation for Economic Education and enrolls with the Seminar Network and Americans for Prosperity. Ben Deming is a director at AmPhil and leads our Rocky Mountain Region consulting team based out of Denver. He previously served as a major gifts officer with the Fellowship of Catholic University Students and as Director of Development with ACE Scholarships in Denver. And Whitney Athade is an associate director at AmPhil and leads our Chicago-based consulting team. Previously, she was the director of development for the Independent Women's Forum and a freelance fundraising consultant. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and let's get started. So today we want to talk about year-end fundraising and year-end giving. So I want to kick things off with a question for you, Ben. Why is it so important for nonprofits to spend so much time focused on their year-end giving strategy?
Great question, Joe. So I'm looking down here for some of my notes so I don't mess it up. But some interesting data points for you all is that 31% of all annual giving is done in December. And of that, 12% of that giving happens in the last 3 days of the year. So the 29th, 30th, and 31st. So it's huge. And with it, an organization on average, up to a third of nonprofits raise between a quarter to half of their annual funding in that 1 month alone. So it's so huge. But I know your next question will be like, well, that's great. That happens in December, but why are we meeting about this in October? Because while they give in December, they make those decisions usually 90 days in advance to give. So this is prime time for you all.
Anybody else have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I just emphasize Ben's point that the cultivation or stewardship at the previous donor of yours really does start now or earlier in the year. The ask may come a little bit later, but the decision making is starting to happen now. A lot of times I used to say this to my team, a lot of our donors, they cut their checks in December. If they're a foundation, maybe the board is making a decision from a meeting in December, but most individual donors, especially larger ones, they're making the decision earlier than that. Even whether it's a yes or no, we're going to give to you, or they've already arrived on yes, but they're determining giving amount. Yeah, that's usually happening earlier.
Yeah, most money just comes in Q4 and Q1, which is why it's also important. Like maybe you don't get it, maybe you're not able to close the gift in Q4, but that will hopefully bear fruit in Q1, because if people don't give Q4, the second most likely quarter to give is Q1.
So given that, Aaron, what you were saying about the fact that people are making their decisions, they start making their decisions on where to give their year-end gifts much earlier than, the last couple of days of the year, or even the last couple of weeks of the year. When's the right time to start planning for year-end fund? Are we already too late to plan for year-end fundraising? If there are organizations that are on right now that are saying, I'm just getting started with my year-end fundraising planning. Is it too late?
Yeah. No, I think it's the classic, the best time to do it was yesterday, and the next best time to do it is today. So no, it's not too late. It depends on how your donor base looks. It depends on those kind of patterns that you see. It depends on the relationships you have with your major donors, depending on where some of those cultivation points and solicitation points need to come in. But in broad strokes, no, I wouldn't wait any longer, right? By the time you're looking at, even if you're doing something relatively simple, like a few digital pieces, right? Some emails that are gonna come out between now and the end of the year. Maybe you're doing a mailing. Maybe you're doing, which I highly recommend, by the way, and we can talk more about this, if you're doing Christmas cards or something like that. That all takes time. I think, if you, most of the folks, who are joining us, most of y'all have probably been in the fundraising space for a little while. These things don't happen overnight. Data's never perfect when you're mailing stuff and needs to be cleaned up. We know that there's the post office is getting slower and slower. We know that we're neck deep in an election season right now. So even if your organization has nothing to do with anything political, there's a lot of mail going out right now. That's from campaigns or from PACs that are clogging up mailboxes, and you've got to stand out in that. So yeah, the time to plan, like I said, the best time to do it was yesterday. Next best time is today. It's not too late, but I would figure out what you're going to do, what it looks like in a very practical sense, and then who is executing on it and what timeline. Because the reality is, and I know this is a long answer, the reality is we say we have 3 months. You lose a week over Thanksgiving. Most donors are not going to be very responsive then. And then you lose at least another week over Christmas. And Christmas falls on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, actually, this year. That week's kind of shot. That most donors are not really going to want it. For most of the donors, not all of them, are not going to want to hear from you there. So really, we're talking about 2.5 months in reality. But Joe, yeah, that's my thoughts on that. Sorry, Whitney, go ahead.
Yeah, practically speaking, I would just want to say where I kind of am with my clients and their workflow. We're reviewing year-to-date contacts with their major gifts, like their major donors. And so if someone has not had a touch point yet this year, we're making darn sure that we have plans to do so in the next month or two. And then secondly, we're getting printer quotes for their year-end solicitation. We're drafting the copy for that solicitation right now because it takes time. And because there is so much mail, not just campaign mail, but even after that, Christmas cards, printers are really busy Q4 too. You want to make sure that you get on their calendars for, a drop date when you want it.
And so we've talked about, what if we haven't started yet? Ben, when you're working with clients and in the ideal scenario, it's February and you're thinking, okay, when are we going to start planning for the year end for this year? What's the ideal time to begin planning for the year end?
Yeah, I love that. Typically, right, if you have a 1 year or 3 year plan, right, it's much earlier than that. If you're starting in the early, if you're in February, you're saying, hey, when do we start year end? I think now in February is the time to think through that in an ideal world, right? Like you think through your thematic calendar mailings, and then what's the drop dates, and would that actually resonate with your donor base, and then you back in that, right? And then what's your activity of engaging major donors, right? And so when are you getting in front of those individual donors, and what are your asks set to happen, and then when do you think you close? One of the things that Aaron made me think about earlier is what, for my clients, I typically say, hey, if you're having a lagging month or a lagging quarter, what were you doing 90 days prior? Like, oh, well, I wasn't hitting my call quota. Okay, well, you should increase that, right? And so you should have because usually you will feel, if you're feeling lagging now, it's probably because you didn't hit your meeting numbers a quarter before. So one thing I also just made me think of as we're approaching year end is, a lot of donors need urgency, right? You help them in that urgency. And I was thinking, for all those who have a fiscal year end come this year end, is to double that down on that with your donors and say, hey, for next year, we're planning with the gifts that we closed today, we are able to project out how many people we can serve, or how many people we can feed, or how many locations we can go to. So every gift today counts, right? Kind of double down on that urgency. So ideally, and then for major gifts, I'm always telling people for the last quarter, typically at AMFA, we say about 45 per full-time major gift officer, 45 a quarter. Hey, here's your chance to hit 60, right? Close the year really strong, right? So because January will be a down month. So,
Joe, can I touch on a technicality that Ben just made me think of? So we're talking about year end, and we're talking about Q4, Q1, 2, 3, and 4 in terms of calendar years. And I recognize not every nonprofit's fiscal year runs parallel to its calendar year. But I've had this conversation with a few organizations that I've worked with either internally or externally who were in that situation. And the reality is donors don't think about that. 99 point something% of your donors do not know or care when your fiscal year runs. Maybe there's one or two really sophisticated major donors who do for some reason. Your board certainly would. They are thinking in terms of calendar year. So even if your fiscal year does not end December 31st, that is where it does in a donor's mind, right? Because they're making decisions based on where their finances are. Certainly tax benefits do play a role in there. It's not a main driver of giving, as we know, but it does play a role depending on the amount, certainly. So I just wanted to point that out, because I do recognize that's not the case for every organization, but just know it really, at least from what we've seen, it has almost no bearing in how your donors actually think about their timing of giving.
correct. Yeah. If you do it well, we have some clients who have their fiscal year ends at this time, but their year end is obviously December, but their fiscal year end is March. And there's actually 2 spikes, because that's what they message really well to their donors of saying, hey, hurry up, your year end gift means a lot, right, for them. And then towards the end of the year, they're saying, hey, when we close the books, it's planning season for next fiscal year, right? So they're able to kind of lean in on that. It's all how you frame it.
It's creating a sense of urgency,
exactly,
which is very important. Creating a sense of urgency. December 31st is right around the corner. You need to send that check in, because you need to get it counted towards your fiscal year for tax purposes. Other ways of creating urgency, if I could just chime in there, is getting a matching gift, which is also a great excuse to reach out to your major donors, right? Because major donors love giving to something specific like that. And we have so much data that just shows that it helps drive and increase response rates to campaigns that have a matching gift. So it's a win-win that you have an excuse to reach out to a major donor and maybe get them to upgrade a little bit for the sake of a matching gift. And then you can also increase the response from your lower level donors with that matching gift. And having a deadline helps create that sense of urgency. The matching gift is only good until December 31st. Please give today.
And just to clarify a little bit of what we were talking about, Ben, too. Yeah, I've seen it and have done it myself, where you do play out the fiscal year, right? Even though but I still found that most donors, particularly if they weren't higher dollar donors who were just a little more in the know, still were very much on a calendar year kind of basis of giving. Now that said, and this may be taking us down a rabbit trail, Joe, so pull me back if that's the case. But when we talk about urgency, I mean, I completely agree, Whitney, and kind of tying these things together, right? We want to create that sense of urgency, and we want to create it around the times where it makes the most sense. There's the very natural timing of the end of the calendar year, like we said. But if you are looking at it where your fiscal year doesn't run parallel, I also would, say be careful we don't stray into the give to us because it's the end of our fiscal year. I think the messaging still has to be, no, you're giving to us because you care about this mission, you care about the impact, you're tied to our organization, you want to have an impact through our organization. Just so happens that this would be a great time to do it, and less of it's March 31st. Funny enough, that's when our fiscal year used to end. Pros and cons to that I can talk about. And it's not like, oh, hurry up because we need to count this on the books or we need to whatever. Yes, we're thinking that internally, certainly that's got to be on our minds, but in the way we message it to donors, the urgency is, no, we want to have this impact and this is the best way to do it.
Yeah, and that's going to bring us into our next topic. But before we do, Whitney, Matthew has a question which relates back to what you said about how Q4 giving can lead into Q1, a bump in Q1, and he has a question, that you would think that the bump in Q4 giving would mean that Q1 would lag. Why are you saying that there's kind of a bump in Q1 as well?
Well, I think some of it is passive and accidental. I think that some checks get sent and, they count for tax purposes for the prior year, but you don't actually get in your bank account until the next calendar year. Like some places, yeah, it might just be an accounting thing, or like they get the year-end solicitation, they forget to put it in the mail, but they do want to give. They still have, their year-end bonus from the year. So they're going to put it in. And then there's just a lot of foundation deadlines for December, January, which I think drives the Q1 bump as well.
Could I jump in there? I think it's really important for us as nonprofits to have standard operating procedures on how we receive a check, right? And how we process donations. I had a client, we did a direct response. We did a mailing for them, and he called me and said, yeah, mailing does not work. We didn't receive any Q4 gifts, and I can't believe we did this engagement. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm sorry to hear about that. And he said, but you'll be glad to know we've had amazing January so far. And I'm like, oh, really? Well, when you look back at all the checks, they were dated December 30th, December 31st, and they were sent to him and they processed them as January gifts. But frankly, they were actually December gifts, right? And so I think that's just really important to have a standard operating procedure, right? If a donor,
it's supposed to be based on the postmark date.
Postmark date, yep,
That's right.
Yep, exactly. And so you should really factor that in. So now I'm a little bit more lenient, right? If someone puts a check in the mail and dates it December 31st, but the postmark doesn't get through to till the 1st, like, I kind of want to kind of honor that, but.
No, that's a December. Yeah, that's a December gift.
Yeah, that's what that in my mind it would be. So yeah,
that's the date they put on the check.
So, and also remember, activity drives results, right? So if you're doing all this December activity, even if the gifts come in January 15th, a lot of times it's driven by the fact that you were very active in November and December.
Correct.
So
yeah,
that's the all of this leads to a bump in Q1, particularly in January, right, is really what we're talking about. So,
yeah.
All right, so we want to get into the nitty gritty a little bit of year-end fundraising, the how and the what. So there's two things we want to talk about. First, I want to talk a little bit about the messaging of your year-end appeals, and then about the specific tactics you use in your year-end fundraising. So, so Whitney, in your experience, what is the best type of messaging for year-end fundraising appeals? What's most compelling to donors and makes them want to give?
I'm so glad you asked me this question, because now I can go off on a tirade. Too many nonprofits simply replay what they've done the prior year. And that is not as motivating as casting a forward-looking vision. Like, join with us and let's make a difference in the year to come. You can share some highlights from the prior year. But if it's all about the prior year and everyone is like warm and fuzzy and content and happy, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Like, you need to remind donors that let's spin it positive. Like, we've had a great year, but we are still up against X, Y, and Z. And that's why we need you to come alongside us and help us achieve A, B, and C. And so helping invite the donor into the mission. Amphil, we're very big on the quest for belonging and having donors feel like they're the hero of this story. And that is really the most compelling message that you can give at year's end. But it's an opportunity to cast a big vision. Like, unlike other appeals throughout the year where you might get more granular and specific about certain campaigns, year end is when everyone's reflecting, right? Everyone's thinking about their own personal year end goals and what they'd like to achieve in the upcoming year. And that this is an opportunity for your nonprofit to do the same.
Yeah, great points. And so, Ben, where does the give to get a tax deduction messaging fall in, right? Because a lot of times when I'm working with nonprofits, they say our message for the year end is give by December 31st, so you get a tax deduction. That's what people care about. Where does that fit?
That's funny that you asked that. I mean, for sure, if you are part of a tax credit organization, yeah, sure, you're right, and you get tax credits for a gift to you, yeah, lean in on that. But it's pretty funny, both Money for Good and I think was a major study that they did on what motivates donors to give, and Jerry Panis, tax deduction giving ranks the lowest for why people ever want to give. So I don't, I just don't find it strong. To what Whitney's point is, let the focus be on the mission and what you're trying to accomplish. So that'd be my big key there.
Yeah, I completely agree. To add to that, I say jokingly, it's not really tongue in cheek, I guess, but it's like, yeah, of course, if you're a donor, of course you're going to take the tax deduction if it makes sense based on how you structure your taxes. But extremely rare, especially in the space, the nonprofits that we're all in, right? For someone to go, oh, the only reason I gave to you was because I needed to write it off before the year end. They're going to do it, but that's not what motivates them. I would also argue, if you have a donor like that, sure, take the money, let them write it off. They're probably aren't a very strong prospect for retention the next year. That's the main kind of motivating
quid
factor.
pro quo donors.
Yeah,
quid pro quo donors or not.
It comes across as like, I'm giving this, I needed to park this somewhere, and you were just the next best place I could think. Think of that versus, I deeply believe in what you're trying to accomplish and the good you're trying to do in the world, and I want to be a part of that. I mean, those could not be more polar opposite. And that's why it's not shocking when you think about human behavior and the way most people view the world, and we find that, oh, tax deduction, was it been in the studies, wasn't it a list of, it was like 10 or 11 reasons, I think, I'd have to look again, of why a donor gives, and it was either next to last or dead last was for what motivates them to give was a tax deduction. So make sure, if you're a 501c3, that people know that it's tax deductible, but do not lead with that messaging.
And I think a lot of, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, a lot of that thought on the organizational side is a misunderstanding of why people give at the year end, right? Like, it's easy to understand, well, you get a tax deduction in April if you give by December 31st, but that's not the primary driver of why the year end is such a big, fundraising season, right? The people are in a more philanthropic mood at the year end for a lot of different reasons, and at the very bottom, right, is the tax deduction.
I had a thought on that, Joe.
Yeah, go ahead.
Someone asked, hey, is a mailing campaign the best way to approach year-end giving, or should we just consider online? And I would say, and it kind of caveats it, kind of segues into what you were just kind of alluding to. The answer is both, right? So you should have a multi-channel approach, right? It should be on through that there should be the theme ties in from what they receive in their email inbox to receive what their physical inbox on social media, all across your organization. They're getting the same consistent theme. A lot of times when it comes to year-end givers, I'm sure you might all be familiar with, they call the marketing power of 7, right? You have to hear something 7 times before you say, you know what, I'm going to buy that product, right? I heard a number of people say how awesome it was, right? Studies are showing us more now like the marketing power of 11 or 12 because we're bombarded so much. And so often when it comes to year-end campaigns, people always say, oh, you know what, I've been meaning to send that group a gift. I've just been so busy and something's been happening, right? I'm on a board for an organization here in town, and I was the last person to register for their gala recently. I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this, and I'm recruiting people to come to. It's just because I get busy, and so I would say the same thing is true. Is the more that you can have that consistent multi-channel approach throughout the year, a lot of times we're reminding people to do that. And then one great way, it's called the presidential highlight, or some people refer to it as the Obama highlight. But what they'll do is it'll say something like, hey, act now and renew your membership to our organization, our giving, and you highlight it a lot, like, oh yeah, I forgot to give to them this year, right? So in a poll of people who lapsed, one of the funniest responses, the top 2 responses was that was my spouse who gave, not me, which is funny. And the other one was, oh, I didn't think I ever stopped giving, but their last gift was 2 or 3 years before. They don't think of themselves as a lapsed donor. They gave in some recent memory. So,
and that you bring up a great point, Ben. I think that having a lapsed donor strategy for year end is super important, both for your major donors, because even your major donors forget the last time they gave sometimes, right? And so having a lapsed donor strategy for your major donors, and then also segmenting, if possible, your year-end appeal or your year-end email appeal, so that the lapsed donors get a little bit of a, we miss you. You last gave on X date, like, renew your membership from, whatever date. It just helps remind them, because it's usually just an honest mistake that they've forgotten.
We're hitting on a couple of good things here, and this actually ties into a question I see in the chat about how end of year giving could be impacted by the election, and I do want to touch on that. But to kind of tee that up on both what you're saying, Ben and Whitney, is that it is also while it is the time of year that donors give most frequently, give the most on the whole, it's also a time of year where you are competing against the most other nonprofits, right? You're competing for donor attention in a time where it's very, very saturated. And that's the reason, one of the reasons for that kind of multi-channel appeal that Ben was talking about. It's not really should we do mail or digital? Absolutely do both if resources allowed. And that's the reason, right? Because everyone's asking at this time of year. They're going to be getting hit from all sides, including from groups they haven't given to in years. And that's, obviously very crowded. And that kind of segues into, well, I was going to share a funny story about a donor who thought he had given, but I'll share that. I'll save that for later. That ties into the election. And this is a really interesting one. So I'm a sample size of 1. So this is just my observation. But what I have seen over the past few presidential election cycles in the nonprofit world, really 2012 and on, is that it really depends on what kind of work your organization does and what the economy looks like, which would also be true whether it's an election year or not. But if your organization is in the policy space, if you're a 501c3 that's working on policy issues, if you're a C4, obviously you wouldn't be tax deductible, but you're doing advocacy or something like that. It depends. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but I do at times see a dip in giving to those groups because a lot of their donors tend to be very politically minded, and they're very, very focused on winning an election, particularly this year. Regardless of where you fall on it, it's going to be a close election, which demands a lot of resources from donors like that. But that's not always the case. And I would say the main guard against that, because the space I was in, is to make it abundantly clear, not just at year end and not just in presidential years, but all the time, where your unique value add is. Yeah, we're not advocating for a particular candidate. We can't legally do that, nor would we want to. But here's why we matter, even when there's a presidential election, right around the corner that's got everyone's attention. And that goes back to something I think we were saying earlier. I'm speaking in generalities here, but when you go into year-end messaging, yes, you want that urgency. And I completely agree with you, Whitney. It shouldn't be overly backwards looking. It should be looking ahead, celebrating accomplishments, but looking ahead. But at the same time, it also shouldn't be a drastic departure of how you've talked about yourself throughout the year. So if you're coming into, we're going into November, here in a month, the election will be held. Between now and the end of the year, regardless of the results and kind of regardless of what your organization is working on, I don't think you want to suddenly shift all your messaging to try and fit into what's going on just at this particular time in the country. I think that steady course of why you matter, why your work matters, is the way to go. Sorry, I was kind of rambling, but that's my thoughts on the election.
I love it, Aaron. I'm going to double down on it.
Yeah.
I have a client who's, it's an election year, so giving is down. I said, oh, okay, great. And we look back at their KPIs, and they're like, oh, well, we chose not to do that mail because we know the response was going to be bad, and we chose to kind of limit on who we're visiting with. And I'm like, oh, well, I think it's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies, right? They're like, well, it's an election year, so it's going to be down. Therefore, I'm going to do less. And I think, no, all the more you should do more, right?
Yeah.
So,
and when I see it down, I really do. When I say that, most of what I've seen, it's been very specific donors. And yes, unfortunately, they do tend to be larger ones. But the donor base as a whole, even if you're in the policy space, maybe some dips here and there, but the hits tend to come from a handful of very specific donors who go, no, I'm maxing out the campaigns and I'm giving to PACs right now. Come back to me in the new year.
But if you're doing things right and you're attracting the right type of donor and you're building a community of like-minded people who feel attached and identify with your mission, it's not going to affect you as much as you think it will. What I actually think is going to affect things this year, not to be a negative Nancy, but is the hurricane. I would strongly recommend considering like suppressing zip codes of the most affected areas. Or maybe, I don't know, North Carolina in general just was hit so hard. I think that all North Carolina donors are going to just be feeling it. They're going to be giving for the next several months very generously to help rebuild and just help with very urgent needs. And I have seen in the past on certain situations like this where you are like, whoa, we should suppress this city or this zip code because of extenuating circumstances. So that's just something to think about. So you come across as more thoughtful. And you can pick back up with those donors in January and what have you. But I just would be very hesitant to solicit North Carolina at year's end.
I've also had clients who, what they did was they muted those zip codes, but they've also taken those zip codes and done a special mailing and just says, hey, we're with you in this time. Please let us know if we could be of resource to you. And they're not even health and humanitarian service groups, right? So when they do pick back up mailing, who do you think they're going to remember? Right. So I always, now that's not why they do that. They did that because they genuinely care about their, that donor population that is there. So I always thought that was pretty meaningful. So as opposed to not doing anything. So, one thing that I was going to tailor in because someone asked a question about, credit cards and what to do with those cards expire. I love, this is going to sound crazy, but live bunts and side bunts. If you've never heard of it, they're my favorite. They're called last year, but unfortunately not this year, or some year, but unfortunately not this year. And so that means, did they give last year, but they haven't done so this year, or have they given ever, and then just haven't done so this year? And I would encourage you all to run those reports and find out who's on there, right? Who and how much did they give, and see if they would renew that gift. And my favorite way to do it is to kind of make a challenge and a bit of fun with it, right? If you have a really long list and you're the director of development, I wouldn't say, hey, call through all of them. You're gonna kill yourself, right? But what we used to do is we would our head of development would come in and he'd get coffee and breakfast burritos for everyone and kind of make it a fun day and say, okay, whoever gets the most calls gets to choose lunch today and by noon. And if you get the most amount of closes, you get this kind of prize. Something very small and insignificant that kind of gamifies or makes it fun for everyone to do. And I highly suggest that because you're doing a lot of phone calls, a lot of call volume. It's a great way to get key volunteers or board members in. And if you get them a script to say, hey, Whitney, thank you so much for your gift of $1,500 last year. Wanted to see if you would mind doing that again and maybe talk through where the organization is headed. Those are always my favorite. And to mix those up with people who credit cards have expired.
Well, in very practical terms, Ben, what you're talking about is getting in front of them. And this goes back to the very beginning, right? The point is, the more you can get in front of them, the more you can get in touch with them, the better I think you're going to stand out. Yes, there is a limit where it's just way overboard. Obviously, I'm not saying call them every day or something like that, but being creative in how you stand out and putting yourself in front of them is critical. And I know, most of us are not thinking in these terms, but we do see it sometimes where the year-end plan is just a hope that everyone renews, and that's not going to happen for the myriad of reasons that we've laid out here. Joe, do you mind if I jump on a question here in the chat?
Go for it.
It's one that I feel very passionately about.
Yeah,
so There's a great question here about adding research stats to your end of year mailer. And I would assume that's going in your digital stuff as well. Thoughts on numbers and stats drawing people in, or should we use them alongside good storytelling? Use them alongside good storytelling. I cannot emphasize enough. Very rarely would I say lead with the statistics. I would 999 times out of 1,000 say lead with the story. Talk about the impact. Talk about the people that are affected in a positive way by their gift. I'm not even going to say buy your work. I'm going to take it a step further and say buy your gift, because you're a vehicle of impact for their giving. There's a great place then to bring in statistics. How many? What area? What percentage do we see this issue that we're working on decrease? What percentage on this good thing we've been trying to do increase? Absolutely, that needs to be in there. Great way to add some graphics and visual appeal. But if given the choice between, do we run a testimonial with somebody's picture and how your organization through the support of donors impacted them in their community versus some graphs with some numbers, I'm picking the testimonial every single time.
Totally.
Usually, fortunately, you don't have to pick between the two. I think it's a great idea to use both, but lead with the story and back the story up with the data. That's my advice.
And we have data to back up this non-data approach in that only 3% of donors actually make charitable decisions based on ROI or based on those impact numbers that you have. So yes, sometimes you'll get in the weeds with like the rare donor who wants to get in the weeds about ROI, but that's 3%, not the vast majority of donors.
Yeah. Funny, they want to see it's working, right? They want to know that you have reach. They want to know that you're not, they want to know that it's working. But numbers alone, at least in nonprofit fundraising, are not just like tax deductions. Yeah, they're there. Yeah, people will take advantage of them when they're put in front of them, but they're not the leading reasons that people give.
Yep. Funny. I'm going to jump in and say, funny you should ask. In Jeremy Beer's newest book, The Quest for Belonging. So we're super grateful that Jeremy is the founder of Amphil. One of the things he actually highlights is studies done with research stats versus, they did 3 different four, a control group. And then he did a mailer with stats alone, and then a mailer with stats and a heavy narrative, and then also one just on the narrative. And the narrative performed the best significantly. So it's a very, very interesting thing, but I think Caitlin put that in the chat. Yep, The Quest for Belonging. It's a fantastic book, but not saying you can't do it. And I think there might be reasons why you should. But to Aaron's point, the data backs up narrative is still the strongest. So
let's move for a minute to the tactics of year-end giving, because everybody who's on the webinar today is at different levels and or different experience levels, and some folks are at organizations that this may be their first ever organized, systematic year-end fundraising campaign. So kind of as a baseline, and again, with the caveat that every organization is different, what does a typical well-run year-end giving strategy look like? What kind of strategies are in the mix? I'll open that up to everybody if there's somebody who feels like they really want to tackle that one.
Whitney, you look like you want to.
Sure.
Probably.
I definitely think a well-written, narrative-based year-end appeal is important to send in November. I would say, a week or two after the election is fine. I think some people are scared to mail so soon after the election, but if your messaging is right, it won't matter. Like if you've been building the relationships, if you've been building the proper narrative for why your mission is important, then the election will just won't matter as much. So having a letter in the mail, sending an email that is along the same lines, drop and get the email timed. It's so hard with USPS these days, but maybe like 7 to 10 days after you drop the letter, like, have you seen my letter yet? And then a couple days later, have you opened the letter? Like another, follow up on the same theme of whatever was in the physical letter. And then, I have some clients who will email their list a dozen times between mid-November and the end of the year. And they do it because they don't have that many unsubscribes and they keep making money. And so along those lines and logic is email as much as you can without hurting your unsubscribe rate, without hurting your open rate, without, and if you're still bringing in donations, then you're still bringing in donations. And don't be shy about it. Like, this is the time of year to ask. People are expecting that. I would sprinkle in, programming, messaging, and, testimonials in here so that it's not just give every single email that you send. But yeah, you want to be top of mind because so much giving happens in December and so much giving happens that last week.
Yeah, I think just to emphasize and build on what you're saying, Whitney, I think absolutely right. So one, we're talking post-election, right? The election mail, except what didn't make it through before voting that day, you always get the last little the trickles in, but then it stops, right? There's no reason for it, and you have that kind of open up a little bit for you there. And then something you said around emailing a lot. So I completely agree, and I bump into this, and I was actually very much a part of this for a long time, where I was very concerned. Oh, we're emailing our donors entirely too much. And to kind of go back to data backing up a story, I didn't really have data to back that up. It was just a gut anecdotal feeling, I guess. And the reality is, especially in the end of the year, you have to stand out. We talked about this, right? They're getting it from all sides, and you have to stand out. Yes, if your unsubscribes are going up, if your open rates are going down, that's a good indicator that you need to space it out and slow it down. But until you get to that point, I would say, yeah, keep emailing very, very consistently. Send things of value, send things of meaning. Don't just send something for the sake of it. It needs to be grounded in some kind of update or some kind of ask or something like that. But when you're trying to stand out, how many times, I mean, myself included, how many times do you get emails from organizations you've supported, you continue to support, and you love? You don't read every single email they send you. In fact, there's some, I'm sure, because I did it this morning, right? I don't have time to read this, I delete it, but I'll probably read the next one that comes through. I'm not unsubscribing. I don't dislike you. I just don't have time to read it right now. End of year, we hit on this some, but to kind of broaden it, end of year is very busy in terms of fundraising. It's very busy for donors too, right? We were talking about donors forgetting to give. I mean, you've got Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, or Hanukkah, or whatever it is you celebrate. Then the New Year's. If you have kids, they're out of school. If you're traveling to see family, you know, all of these things are competing for attention. And so the more you can stand out, as long as it's not hurting you, and even then, I would say, because I've seen some panic happen, and I was guilty and a part of it too. One or two donors telling you you're emailing me too much is not an indicator to shut down the whole program or to slow down the whole program, unless it happens to be like your two top donors. And even then, I would say, okay, just take them off the list and keep doing what we're doing. If it's a pattern and it's consistent and there's spikes in it, then obviously, yes, we need to revise something. But unless and until you get there, I would be very, very consistent and pretty high output on the digital side.
Aaron, you're making me think of someone I know that they had two donors respond and say, "I can't believe you mail. Why do you spend the money that I give you and purchase stamps and print and paper for this and send this out? I mean, you're so silly that you lose money." But I think a lot of donors don't, and so they shut down their direct response program.
Yeah,
because of it. And I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's crazy." So like Aaron said, pull them off the list and say, "Thank you so much." That's called market of one. But so many people give through the mail. It's crazy, right? And so you'd be silly to shut down that shop. Someone asked a great question on the holiday schedule, the last week of the year. When is the best day to send a final reminder mailer? I'm going to handle that, but I'm also going to jump in and say, I would love to know what Aaron and Whitney think on this. But my personal preference is for the first year-end mailer to hit. Thanksgiving of Thursday, typically, Black Friday, that Friday, come that Monday, that week. So that the week of that'll be December 3rd, I think that week is when I love for mail to come in, right? Like that week is, to me, Golden Week. It has 4 weeks right after it, through the end of the year. And obviously you have the email kicking off at that time. You have social media dripping through there. In terms of a final reminder mailer, I'd probably say a week out, right? Because usually there's
like 7 to 10 days out. So Christmas makes it hard, right? Because it's 7 days before the end of the so it's hard. So December 20th, 21st for a 1-page letter, or even better, I would say a postcard, because it's a quick visual reminder, with a QR code and your website, so that people can give on December 31st. Because most of the people who give December 30th, 31st are giving online.
Yes.
Or maybe they're writing their checks and getting them postmarked, but a lot of online giving happens those last 48 hours.
Yeah, and I know we're talking about hard mailings now, which are, I guess you mentioned it, Whitney, with the USPS, it's a little harder time now. But if you're doing digital, I would send a couple, at least, 2, 3 plus things that week between Christmas and New Year's. I think there's also an angle here. I think it depends on what you're working on too, because depending on what the mission and work of your organization is, you may have something that's a very natural fit. If you're working on, the issue of homelessness or something like that, there's a very sense of urgency. We're talking about it, right? Like that's something that the timing could be even better, but just depending on the issue and what you can talk about, because it's not hey, let's do it before the end of the year. It's like, oh no, there's a very real need here and we need to meet it right now because it's cold out and we can help on this issue. One thing, I brought it up earlier, but this is a good time to touch on it. Christmas cards. I am a big believer in Christmas cards.
Yes.
Now, I've seen it done, and I've done it myself a few different ways. I've done it where it's a mass send from the organization, clearly mass printing, and that's fine, right? I think that's better than nothing. If we're talking about a portfolio of major donors, and that's going to be defined a little differently for each organization. My rule was anyone $1,000 donor and up got a at least a hand signed, usually a handwritten Christmas card. And that I have gotten nothing but positive responses from that. One, because it's so rare to get something in the mail these days that's so personal. When we're talking about direct mail working, that's one thing, but this is something that someone sat down, they bought the card, sat down, hand wrote it, signed it, stamped it, and sent it to you, and was specifically thinking about you at this time of year. You're talking about some people, I don't like you sending me letters and stuff. I have never once had someone say, you sent me a Christmas card. Why?
Yeah.
Don't
No,
do that again.
Never happens. Yeah.
It's a very, very easy, meaningful, timely way to steward gifts. Now, I think it comes in the midst of all the other activity. I don't think it's an either or. It's a stewardship piece, right? It's not, there's no ask in the Christmas card. It's just if they're a previous donor, you're thanking them for all that they've done for you through the year, and sending them off into the holidays and into the new year. But I could go on and on about it, but I'm a big believer in that. Yes, it takes a little bit of time, but is, I think, one of the most meaningful stewardship things you can do at this time of year.
I'll double down on that as well. And for major givers, so like if you have a portfolio of 100 major givers giving 5,000, 10,000 above, for your top 10 to 20, I like sending them like a little token gift of gratitude, maybe some chocolates. One of my favorite gifts, it didn't cost much, but was to a friend of mine who was one of our top donors, and he shared with me that he met his wife at Dairy Queen, and his wife's dad owned a Dairy Queen, and that was their first date, and they hadn't been in like 20 years, and I just heard that, and I bought a $5 gift card to Dairy Queen. And I sent it in, and he said that was the best thing ever, the best gift ever, because he had an excuse to take his wife out on a date, and it was so fun, right? And
That's
that,
adorable.
he's not giving us $100K so he can take his wife out to Dairy Queen for $5. He could buy the Dairy Queen, right? And I also encourage, for those that send them a if you're doing Christmas cards, family cards, send out family cards of you and the family, and have the dog there, and I think what that shows them is, hey, I'm a fundraiser, but I'm also normal, right? And I have interests outside of just asking you for money, and that is always received very positively. And I still have donors today. We just welcomed our fourth kid recently, and they called and they said, hey, we have more baby clothes for you and cute bibs, and because we built up that friendship and that relationship. So I love that.
Sorry, Joe, we've taken this like all over the place.
This is great. Covering questions. So we've got 7 minutes left. 2 questions I wanted to get to. One came in from Rob, and it's about phone calls, right? And maybe I'll hand this over to you, Ben, put your MGO hat on. What's the role of phone calls at the year end, particularly for folks that you've sent the snail mail letter to, you've sent emails, but they're major donors? What's the role and what's the message for a phone call if you're using them at the year end?
Yeah. Ideally, if they are true major givers, go see if you can go get a meeting, right? And lean in. We used to say face to face wins the race. That's kind of a catchy tagline, but I would say, hey, I haven't chatted with you in a while. I'd love to get together for a cup of coffee. Now, if they say, hey, we're busy, we're super busy, I say, I totally understand. Well, let's put that on the calendar for January. One of the things I wanted to run by you is I wanted to see if you'd be willing to make a year-end gift, and you kind of handle it that way and start leaning into, all what Whitney said, how that's going to help you come January, whether it's the end of your fiscal year and you want to, double down on a match, or you want to see how many places you can grow to over the course of the next year and kind of double down that way. So, but I would say pencil something in, and then also see if you can ask for that gift.
And if we're talking in terms of like smaller dollar donors, where we're dialing through ideally a lot more, right? And I think it's coming. You have the mail, you have digital, and you have phone calls. I think it's 2 things. One, anyone, you're talking about live bunts and side bun spin. So anyone who gave last year but hasn't up to this point, and we're into December. It's an interesting time in October, right? Because if you pull your list right now, it's going to look like a lot of people are missing, because typically they gave in December. But if you're getting into December and you're in the first week of December, and there's still a lot of folks, especially if you have it down to the date of, they gave the end of November or even early December of last year. Those are the people I'm going to prioritize calling. We know they've gotten some mail at this point. We know they're getting more. We know they've gotten some digital at this point. We know they're getting more. That's when I would start calling through that list. And I think it's short and sweet. Hey, thanks so much for your support last year. walk them through maybe let's say a story backed up by data, a real quick, walk through, here's the impact that you had, which is, would love to talk about, renewal. You can frame it a little differently than that, but I would start calling through that. And then I would keep a second list of folks that were thinking, right? Because as they come in, and there's going to be a lot of overlap between those two lists, where you're doing stewardship. And if you have the time, and I am talking about small dollar donors here, not major donors. Those, obviously do anything you need to on that front. Where you're doing quick thank you calls. And most of the time you're going to be getting voicemail, but it's worth it. Now, every organization has their own threshold. If you have 10,000 donors who gave $50, okay, we're probably not going to get through that whole list, but start at whatever the threshold is, where they don't have a major gift officer assigned to them, and I would say just start working your way down. But I think it's twofold, right? It's solicitation and then it's stewardship.
And Rob did ask a question that I typed a response to, but what should the board be making the calls? Should staff be making the calls? What have you?
Yeah.
If you can get your board together for like a holiday event, like make it like a cheese board, have some wine, say we're each going to make a dozen calls, or we're each going to spend 30 minutes making calls, and then we're just going to out. It could be a community. I've actually seen this done, gentlemen. Like, it actually can work.
No,
and it's a great community building experience for the board as well.
Yeah.
Well, and to hear, and I know, I hear this and I'm like, okay, good luck getting the board in the room to make calls. But if it can be done, like you said, Whitney. And if you can't do that, talk about meaningful. To have a board member's like, hey, you and I are the same, right? I sit on this board because I care so much about the work that's being done here. You gave for the exact same reasons. We're both supporters of this organization, and I want to just thank you for all that the impact that you've had. That's huge. And then, what I wouldn't say a step down, but in a very, very similar vein, staff is the same way, right? And it's not a framing of I work here, so I have to call you. It's you have made what we've done possible, and this is the impact you're having, and this is the impact this is what we're going to be going into the new year with. So yeah, get staff. If you can get your board involved, that's phenomenal. Absolutely make that happen.
One thing I really like doing is if you do multiple, I'm going to segue into this, but someone said multiple mailings, right? If you do multiple mailings, one thing I like is every mailing that you do is kind of maybe give an update on maybe how you're doing towards that match. So you can kind of recapitulate to those people or go back to those people who haven't quite given yet and say, we're nearly there. Look how close we are, and double down. And it's easy to do digitally. Another thing, if you want to get your board involved or something like this, is maybe do a webinar for your high net worth individuals, right? And have your board there. That's always really fun, and kind of create a sense of community, and maybe hear from the founder or a great speaker, even if it's 30 minutes. I've seen those go over really well. And then you can kind of thank them for joining, and kind of also builds up community as well. So.
All right, we got 2 minutes left, but I don't want to end without asking this question. So it's speed round, but it's a contentious question. So, Whitney, Giving Tuesday, yes, no?
No, thank you. It's a, have you heard of the blue sea versus red sea concept? I don't want to be a part of that personally, but there's always a board member that wants you to do it. And so if you want to pay lip service to it, then you can send an email to your list. You can, my tip for it is to also do social media, like that corresponds with it, and to resend the email to the unopened recipients before the end of the day. That's my one tip, if you decide to do it.
Anybody else? Any giving?
I'll jump in. What makes Giving Tuesday is you, right? So everybody thinks, oh, I'm going to sign up for Giving Tuesday, and it's just going to raise us a whole bunch of money. But if you're not, use it as a lie button, side hunt day. Use that as an excuse to reach out and to call. But I'm with Whitney that the day itself won't raise you a whole lot of money, but it's the activity you do.
I largely agree. I think it does depend on what space your organization is in. There are some who, by just nature of your mission, it just is a little bit of a better opportunity for you, but it's become extremely crowded. Everyone does it. I don't know that it's the best way to stand out anymore. I'm with y'all. If you feel like you need to do something that's a relatively low lift and something that you would probably have done anyways. I've seen too many organizations, again, a few years ago, this may have been a little bit different, but it's gotten so crowded now. I see organizations spend a lot of time and resources for not a whole lot of return on Giving Tuesday. My gripe is not with Giving Tuesday itself. It's with the imbalance between what's put into it and what comes out of it for a lot of organizations. So I'm with y'all.
Yeah. Makes sense. Well, all right. So we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank everybody who joined us for today's webinar. Special thanks to Ben, Aaron, and Whitney for sharing their expertise with us. And I wanted to let everybody know you will be getting a copy of this webinar. So keep an eye on your email over the next couple of days, and you'll be getting a copy and perhaps some additional resources as well. And be sure to visit our website, centerforcivilsociety.org, to keep up to date on all of our future events. We've got a few coming up for the rest of this year. So thanks again for joining us today, and we hope to see you all on another event again soon. Take care.
Appreciate y'all. Thanks, guys.
There you go.